Hello, it's Jim, and we're back for another adventure. Behind me is Fort Tompkins. We're getting ready to take a tour into Fort Tompkins and then go down over the hill, and there is Battery Weed. We are at a national park here in New Jersey on Staten Island, and I'm welcoming you here today. Come along.
My name is Ranger Jose. I've been a park ranger here for the past 4 years now. So let me go ahead and quickly ask you guys this. Where is everybody here from?
Long Island.
Long Island, alrighty, fantastic.
You live here on base.
Okay, there you go.
Indiana.
Russia.
Russia, alrighty. And you?
Live here.
Okay, fantastic. So you guys are, of course, mostly local, which is, of course, going to be the case with pretty much all of New York City. New York, of course, we have very diverse, many groups of communities over here. And the one important thing, of course, that a city like New York needs to have is good protection, good guarding against anybody that might potentially come over here and, of course, attempt to attack, destroy, and invade the city of New York. Which is exactly why Fort Wadsworth has been around since at least the War of 1812. So that's going to be a period of at least 200 years. Now, there were many forts here on the western side of the Narrows since at least the days of the Dutch, as well as the days of the Lenape when they were over here. Once we actually get to the Overlook, you will realize that we are going to be about 150 feet up in the air, which essentially makes Fort Wadsworth, Telegraph Hill, as they used to call it, essentially one of the best spots anywhere in the harbor to use as a lookout point. So why don't we go ahead and start off our tour. We'll start off our tour with a talk on geography, on exactly what makes the Narrows such a special place. It's going to be a map of New York Harbor. So Lower Manhattan, I don't think I actually need to tell you guys this is where all the money is going to be. In 2018, as it was in maybe 1818, all of the money of New York City would have been simply located along Lower Manhattan. So this is the spot that obviously needed to have quite a bit of protection. So, at least in the early 19th century, the state of New York actually would have started to build quite a lot of these old fortifications that were built up initially first by the Dutch and then eventually by the British, especially around here in what's called Governor's Island. Governor's Island, of course, has two main fortifications, Fort Jay and Castle Williams. Over in the lowest tip of Manhattan towards Battery Park is, of course, something called Castle Clinton, which has been around since at least the early 19th century. There's also the two forts of what's now called the Statue of Liberty National Monument. So those two forts, of course, are going to be Fort Wood over in the current Liberty Island, as well as Fort Gibson in what's now Ellis Island. Both of these forts eventually would have become obsolete by the late 19th century, and of course, later on, they became home to both the Statue of Liberty as well as Ellis Island Immigration Station. Later on throughout the decades, especially towards the Civil War, the forts around the Narrows, this little area connecting the upper bay with the lower bay, these started to become very important. So this is when Fort Wadsworth, as well as Fort Hamilton across the Narrows in Brooklyn, this is the era in which we really started to shine here in Wadsworth. Now, later on, throughout the late 19th century as well as early 20th century, the federal government also would have started to build up the older forts around these two areas. This is, of course, going to be the Rockaways, and this area is going to be Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Rockaways, of course, has its own fortress called Fort Tilden, and then over here in Sandy Hook is going to be what's called Fort Hancock. So, put together, these are all going to be the major fortifications of New York City. I did not even mention all these smaller batteries that one might find all throughout Brooklyn, Staten Island, New Jersey, Manhattan, and anywhere else. So the main fortifications we'll be going into is something called Fort Tompkins, which would have served as the main barracks for the soldiers here on base. And then later on, we will then be proceeding towards Battering Weed, which would have served as the main guns of the fort. So essentially, we're going to be comparing and contrasting these two major historic structures. So with that, let's go ahead and walk right on through the parking lot. So we'll make our way right over here first. It's called the dry moat of the fort. Alright guys, so come gather around. So of course this is going to be Fort Tompkins over on your right hand side. Over on the left is actually a big massive wall that would have been used as a defensive structure. Which means that the little area that we're now standing on is of course going to be what's called a moat. Now it was a dry moat, which means that there really never was any water used over here. Rather they actually would have kept this whole entire area dry. The reasoning for that is, well, first of all, we are above the hill. It is going to be a little bit difficult to actually place quite a bit of water to surround this big, massive fortress. Second of all, they really didn't need all that water, just because, of course, we have the counterscarp, or the wall over on your left, as well as the big masonry walls over on your right. Now, this particular dry moat would have been used for essentially trying to defend the fortress. So just in case of an infantry attack or a land-based attack coming from the western side or from the New Jersey side, you would actually expect the enemy to climb right up over that hill. And once they got to the top of the hill, the enemy would drop down thinking that they would already be inside of Fort Tompkins. But of course, that was not necessarily the case. Because, well, they still needed to scale up this wall right over here. By the way, that would not really happen just because, as you guys can see, on both sides of me, you will see these little narrow window slits or ports, whatever you want to call them. These are basically called loopholes or rifle slits. These, of course, are going to be emplacements for riflemen. So behind each and every one of these loopholes is going to be somebody with a rifle. Rather, there's going to be two guys with a rifle. One to shoot, and the other gentleman to load. Now, this whole entire wall is, in fact, going to be covered with all of these loopholes. There's also going to be loopholes over on the left-hand side. And just in case the firepower from the rifles was not enough, there also would, of course, be flank howitzer ports right behind you guys. In fact, there are actually 5 of these flank howitzers on at least 3 sides of the building, or 3 corners of the building. Excuse me. So basically, these flank howitzers were essentially utilized as massive shotguns that could essentially tear apart a human being into bits and pieces. This was not, of course, the spot for you to try to attack and invade New York City. Rather, the U.S. Army, the soldiers stationed over here, really would have expected most of the attacks to come in from the Atlantic Ocean. And, of course, that means that the bigger guns really needed to be placed down below the water, closer to where, of course, those big, massive enemy warships are going to be sailing past here. So later on, in about 20 minutes or so, once we get up to the Overlook, I'll pretty much show you guys the importance of placing the bigger, heavier guns closer towards the water than actually placing it on top of the hill, where you would have a bit of a better viewpoint or advantage over the whole entire harbor. But for now, let's go ahead and walk right down this way. They would have transported these blocks all the way down from New England. Well, they actually would have placed them on barges, sent them down the Connecticut River, at which point they would, of course, be sent out here to New York Harbor. This was the 1850s and 1860s. By that point in time, there were actually new types of technology now developing throughout the country, throughout the planet. That new type of technology was going to be called rifling of guns. As we'll see later on, as we head into the tunnels of Fort Tompkins, you'll see that the older structure made out of sandstone really was not going to be able to defend itself, especially if they're facing the barrel of these rifle newer guns. So let's go ahead and head inside of Fort Tompkins. But before we do so, we do a quick safety talk. Now, Fort Tompkins can make a left turn towards the big open parade ramp. Alright guys, so welcome to Fort Tompkins. Now the doorway that we just entered through is something called a postern gate. Postern gate is basically the main walkway to a fortress. Now the entryway right down this way, this is going to be called a sally port door. A sally port door is basically going to be the main entryway for things like cars, carriages, and vehicles. Now this sally port door would serve a very important job, especially by the early 20th century. The early 20th century, of course, would have seen essentially the advent of brand new cars, vehicles, and other things like that. As you guys can see from at least the eastern side, rather the southeastern portion of Fort Tompkins, these are essentially going to be maintenance garages for the newer cars and vehicles that were now starting to pop up everywhere around the country. In fact, the concrete that we're now walking through, this was essentially all laid out at some point after the Second World War to make way for all of these brand new cars and vehicles. And in fact, by the 1970s, if we were to actually take a look at the parade ground during that time, you'll pretty much see that this whole entire area really would have served as essentially just a motor pool or a parking lot for the U.S. Army. Prior to it being essentially a motor pool, these rooms, especially the ones on the north, on the west, and over in the south side of Fort Tompkins, would have been used as essentially barracks for the soldiers of Fort Wadsworth. There would have been at least 10 soldiers per room, with apparently a nice fine coal stove and room for at least 10 bunk beds. Now, Fort Tompkins, throughout its 200-year history, has seen a number of changes throughout the decades. So initially, most of the fort really was being used up as essentially barracks, living quarters for the soldiers over here. Unfortunately, by 1903, a lot of the rooms were essentially deemed to be unsafe for human habitation, which means that a lot of the soldiers that were living over here now, unfortunately, could not live over here. So that's one reason why they had to actually make use of the campsites over by where the parking lot is now. Fortunately, though, about several decades later, 1929, I did tell you guys that yes, they would have actually built up essentially real housing for the soldiers. Now, in the last 5 years that the Army was here, from about 1974 to 1979, they actually would have operated a schoolhouse here in Fort Tompkins. So if you guys take a look over on your left, you're actually going to see very well worn out sign on the second level of the fort. I know it's very hard to read, but it actually says U.S. Army Chaplain Center School. And from 74 to 1979, you would actually expect at least the second level of Fort Tompkins to be utilized as a schoolhouse. So the sign is actually telling soldiers and students to enter through the doorway on the left, while officers and instructors would enter through the doorway over on the right. Now, at the same time that they were using this as essentially a schoolhouse, the first floor generally would have been used as pretty much office spaces for the U.S. Army. Now, once the Army left in 1979, they would have taken pretty much everything with them, including the schoolhouse. However, the Navy was briefly over here from about 1987 till about the mid-1990s or so, at which point, by 1997, the U.S. federal government actually came in and retook the land over, this time under the Department of the Interior, under the National Park Service, the Park Rangers, us guys. So that would have been at 1997. There would have been many different uses for the fort since then. As you guys can see from all the what looks like a construction site over here, we do still use this up for various different things, including film shoots. We do events over here. Sometimes we'll actually do open houses inside of Fort Tompkins. So why don't we go ahead and actually make our way right down this way. And we'll make our way into the inside of the fort. Now just watch your step as you're making your way over there, folks.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the top was barracks that they deemed unnecessary or unsafe to put them out there, but then they had school kids in here.
Not quite school kids. These guys would have been adults.
Still.
Yes, at least during the 1920s. This rather during the during the early 19th century. By 1903, yes, the U.S. Army essentially deemed the barracks rooms unfit for human habitation. That did not mean, however, that they weren't allowed to use this up for essentially as a schoolhouse.
Okay.
So yes, the actual, the living quarters generally would not have been here, especially by the 20th century. In fact, by that point in time, really nobody would have been living over here. Almost all these soldiers, especially after World War I, would have been living over either that campsite or, in the case of the officers, they would be living in the much more comfortable officers' row, which is called Montsec Avenue. Yep.
Thank you.
No problem. So definitely be very careful as you make your way over through here. So I do apologize for the construction pallets and everything. So right down this way, folks. Okay, so we'll make our way over here and just go ahead and grab a flashlight. Now, as you guys will notice, you guys are now, of course, inside, obviously, Fort Tompkins. Now, I do want to show you guys something real quick before we actually proceed any further. Now, this empty, rotting, rotted out pipe is, well, obviously more than just an empty, rotted out pipe. As you guys might have noticed as you were walking through the parade ground, you might have definitely noticed quite a bit of overgrowth on top of the fortress. And that's because the original fort builders actually would have placed quite a bit of soil on top of Fort Tompkins. The main reason for that is, well, they needed to essentially filter out rainwater in case of a siege or an attack on the fortress. It is actually kind of fascinating. They would actually use up the soil on top of the roof, or the soil on top of the roof, rather, yes, as a way to filter out that rainwater. Now, all that filtered rainwater would then travel through a series of pipes such as this one, and as you guys can see, the water is in fact quite clear, which means that it has been filtered out by quite a bit of the soil that's just right above us. Essentially, all this water is going to be heading down towards a cistern that is, of course, located below us where we're standing here today. So the cistern is actually quite massive. It does actually stretch from here down to at least where we would have first entered through that postern gate. If you guys walk through, you might have definitely noticed a big iron grate down at the bottom. That is going to serve as the main entryway into that particular cistern. So let's go ahead and continue on with the tour. And now at this point, I do want to show you guys the fun part of the tour. We are now going to be heading into the tunnels of Fort Tompkins. Now at this point, I do want you guys to watch your head. The ceiling does start to get very, very, very low, and the ground does start to pick up a bit. So watch your head as you're making your way through the counterscarp gallery.
Were these tunnels used for the outer wall where the dry moat is, where the soldiers would fire?
Yes, in fact, while we actually walk through here, I do want you guys to look through the gun ports over on your left. Of course, you'll notice that is going to be the actual dry moat. Which means that if there were any attacks on the fort, or land-based attacks rather, they would actually expect the enemy to be essentially right above us where the hill is, and they would of course drop down onto the big open space, aka the dry moat, over on the left. Now in case of such an attack, the men here of Fort Wadsworth would all rush out to these very halls, and they would of course start shooting at the enemy. There of course would be 2 soldiers per rifle slit, one to shoot and then the other to load. And that would of course be the ideal situation. Now, in case the soldiers on this side of the dry moat were not able to take down these soldiers right outside, their compatriots over on the inside of Fort Tompkins would essentially finish up the job. Now where we are is essentially also going to be the oldest portion of the entire Fort Wadsworth military reservation. So if you guys take a look right behind you, this big, massive wall that actually stretches from way down there all the way to this side of the fort. This is all going to be the last remaining portions of Fort Tompkins. Now this particular wall is made out of something called sandstone. Sandstone was a very popular building material used especially during the War of 1812. In fact, quite a lot of the forts of New York City, of New York Harbor, would have been built out of the sandstone that you guys are looking at here today. A lot of the sandstone would have been taken from various places in New Jersey, as well as Long Island, and also upstate New York. So generally it was going to be a lot cheaper than going with the much stronger and much heavier, and definitely much more expensive granite. However, by the 1840s and 1850s, because of the new rifled guns, the sandstone walls could no longer actually defend New York City. Just because the rifled guns, the rifled cannon, would now be able to easily blast through these old walls. So the federal government actually decided to start using up the much newer and of course much more expensive granite walls. And they actually would have rebuilt both Fort Tompkins as well as Battery Weed during a little bit before the Civil War, beginning in the 1840s and then in the 1850s, until finally by the 1860s and 1870s, both forts were finally completed. So we'll make our way right back down towards the exit. And just go ahead and make a right turn as soon as you guys, of course, hit the intersection. If you are a soldier over here, yes, you still do need it to eat. So, let me ask you guys this. What types of food do you think a 19th century soldier here in Fort Wadsworth would have access to? What do you think they would eat? Any ideas?
Biscuits, maybe?
Biscuits, yes, they would have gotten, of course, quite a bit of a wheat ration. So, yes, they would be able to make things like hardtack, biscuits, bread, things like that.
Beef jerky, maybe?
Beef jerky, maybe, but honestly, they really didn't have as much access to beef as you might actually expect.
Beans.
I did hear, yes, there you go. That is the magic word, beans. beans is something that the soldiers would have had access to pretty much every day. In fact, I do have a letter over here from a soldier stationed here at Fort Wadsworth. Now, this soldier's name was gonna be Dalton Cooper. Now, in this letter, he is writing to his sister back home. If I can find the actual thing. But yes, generally he was actually writing home to his mother. Unfortunately, I don't have the letter. But generally in this letter, he does actually talk about the fare here in the island. Basically, he says that he is given beans for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner every day. And at one point, he actually says, I wish the soldiers would have some mercy on the soldiers and not raise any more beans. And that's because they were pretty much eating it every day for every single meal. It's basically what the army would have fed them. The main reason for actually feeding these soldiers beans is because beans are very nutritious. They're full of fiber, they're full of protein. And if you have to feed almost 2,000 soldiers over here, yes, unfortunately beans will be your only option. However, that doesn't mean that beans was the only thing that these guys would eat. Remember, this is New York City. We have access to essentially one of the greatest natural harbors, literally just right outside of our doorstep. New York Harbor would have had the largest oystering industry anywhere in the planet. It would have rivaled that of the London oyster industry. Now, this was all prior to the 1920s and 1930s. Unfortunately, by then, by the 20s and 30s, quite a lot of New York City's oystering industry was now starting to disappear. And unfortunately, that is because of just the sheer amount of humanity living in New York City. So unfortunately, because of all the people here, the oysters just could not handle it anymore. So essentially, they pretty much all died off. And with the dying off of the oysters here in New York Harbor, so did the industry. But oysters was something you could find everywhere throughout New York City. It was something that the very rich ate, the very poor. In fact, there are actually evidence of oyster shells, really essentially mounds of oyster shells all throughout the harbor. And that is all from the Lenape when they were over here. Essentially, they've used up quite a bit of the oysters over here, and since then, the Dutch and then the British have also been using up the harbor as well. Now, we talked about food, and then we talked about their emergency drinking water. Let's talk about the recreation here in the harbor. So let's talk about something fun. Since we are, of course, just coming out of Wimbledon, let's talk about tennis for a little bit. So tennis was something, of course, that was brought to New York City in the 1870s and 1880s. In fact, it was brought here to Staten Island by somebody by the name of Mary Outerbridge. Now, if you guys are familiar with Staten Island roadways, that name does sound kind of familiar, right? That's because her brother was somebody by the name of Eugenius C. Outerbridge. Now, Mr. Outerbridge was essentially the very first president of what we now call the Port Authority of New York and of New Jersey. But since he did have quite a lot of power and influence, he was essentially able to have his sister Mary import the game of tennis back to Staten Island. And then, of course, once she brought back the game here to the island, the local population really enjoyed the game. Which, of course, would lead me to my next photograph. By the 1880s, the whole entire fortress essentially would have been turned into, guess what? A tennis court. Now, this is a view of Fort Tompkins from around 1888. As you guys can see with the fort right over here, as well as with the picture, yes, this is going to be the same exact spot, same exact structure. So you guys can actually see the arched rooms over on the left. You can also see the catwalk, as well as the old staircase that would lead up to that catwalk. And of course, in the center, you're going to find all the nice ladies and gentlemen of Staten Island essentially spending a nice, warm Sunday or Saturday afternoon or whatever it is, playing a nice game of tennis here on base.
What surface are they playing? Grass?
It's going to be grass, yes.
Grass.
Initially in the 19th century, almost all of tennis was played on grass. So that's why the British actually would have called it lawn tennis rather than just regular tennis. This was the 1880s. During the 1880s, there really were only about 41 soldiers stationed over here in Fort Wadsworth. This was, of course, between the wars, so there really wasn't anything much happening over here, which is one reason why they really would have allowed this to actually happen. Fortunately, or rather unfortunately, a few years later, the Army realized that, yes, maybe we needed to actually use up the space for actual, more important things other than playing tennis. But Fort Wadsworth really has been utilized as essentially a place of leisure, a place of recreation for many, many, many centuries. Once we get to the Overlook, I will read to you guys a few different letters from very famous folks that have been here in the island, essentially stating that Staten Island is going to be one of their favorite places because it is so unique to the city of New York. We are only just a few miles across from the hustle and bustle of Lower Manhattan, while here in Staten Island, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries, almost all of the island essentially would have been countryside, which means that this would have been the great place, the best place rather, to have all of your vacation spots. So, now Fort Tompkins was named after somebody by the name of Daniel D. Tompkins. Daniel D. Tompkins was the Vice President of the United States under James Monroe in the early 1820s. However, prior to that, he was actually the governor of the state of New York during the War of 1812. He was actually a very, very, very wealthy man from here on the island, and because he had quite a lot of money, he was essentially able to drop quite a bit of his own wealth into the financing of all the forts of New York Harbor, which at that point in time was still under the command of the state government, the New York state government, rather. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Tompkins would have dropped a little bit too much of his own money, and by the end of the war, it actually made him bankrupt, which is one reason why he actually turned into pretty fairly crazy, violent drunk by the time he became Vice President of the United States. In fact, Mr. Tompkins, during his vice presidency, did have the essentially the image of being the drunkest guy in the room. And unfortunately, that was all because of his role in helping to finance the fortification of New York Harbor. He is a very, 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 very important name throughout all of New York City and throughout New York State. In fact, you'll find his name pretty much everywhere. So if you guys go out to Tompkins Square Park in Manhattan, that would be named after him. If you ever go out to Tompkins County, where Cornell University is, that also would be named after him. And of course, for here in the island, the neighborhood of Tompkinsville is, of course, going to be named after him as well. So a very, very, very sad story, but yes, in the end, he essentially helped make Fort Wadsworth what it is today. So we shall continue on, and we'll head towards the Overlook, and we'll start off round number 2, second leg of our tour. Alright folks, so this is of course going to be New York Harbor. And you do have, of course, this really fine, wonderful, amazing view of New York City, of the Upper Bay, of Brooklyn, and even of New Jersey as well. So basically the big structure that you guys are looking at right down there, this is going to be called Battery Weed. This would have served, of course, as the main guns for the fortification. Now, there generally would have been space for at least 116 guns for this very big, very massive structure. The fort itself would have been built around the War of 1812 and then reconstructed by the Civil War. So same time period as the building up, as the construction of Fort Tompkins. Now, where we are, of course, is going to be key. This is essentially going to be the main gateway, the main entryway into New York Harbor. So naturally, of course, you needed to have all these different fortifications. So we had fortifications here on the western side of the Narrows. There also would be, of course, the guns of Fort Lafayette. Essentially, Fort Lafayette would be that little man-made island right underneath where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge Tower is. For the longest time, from about War of 1812 till 1959, Fort Lafayette would have existed over in that space. Fort Lafayette would have had space for at least almost 100 guns. Not as quite as Battery Weed, but Fort Lafayette would have served as at least the main guns of the Brooklyn side. So anybody that was trying to pass from the Atlantic, trying to make their way into New York Harbor, they would have, of course, had to pass through the two main guns defending the harbor, Wadsworth and Lafayette. Now, just in case they did get past through all of these guns, there also would have been the smaller batteries posted throughout Staten Island and Brooklyn. And of course, if those batteries didn't somehow take down these warships, there also would be the batteries as well as the forts of the upper bay. Now, I did also mention to you guys that this is more than just a military fortification with loads and loads of guns and soldiers. This spot was also utilized as, of course, a place of leisure. Now, one of the folks associated with Fort Wadsworth, especially its more leisurely side, is a U.S. American writer by the name of Henry David Thoreau. You guys might have definitely heard of him. So Thoreau actually lived in Staten Island for a period of about 6 months in 1843, from about May till about October or November of that year. While he was living in Staten Island, he actually would have walked here to the Overlook every morning before heading off to work. He actually really enjoyed being here in the island just because this was a place of nature. Very, very quiet, pastoral place, whereas New York City he did not like so much. I actually have a letter over here about Mr. Thoreau, about his views on the city. He says, "I don't like the city better the more I see it, but worse. I am ashamed of my eyes that behold it. It is 1,000 times meaner than I could have imagined. It will be something to hate." And this is the probably the best part in the whole entire letter. He says, "The pigs in the street are the most respectable part of the population. When will the world learn that 1,000,000 men are of no importance compared with one man? But I must wait for a shower of shillings, or at least a slight dew or mizzling of sixpences before I explore New York very far." And he also does talk quite a bit about the nature, the ecological side of Staten Island. He says, "The sea beach is the best thing I have seen. It's very solitary and remote, and you only remember New York occasionally. The sea seems very near from the hills, but it proves a long way over the plain, and yet you may be wet with the spray before you can believe that you are there. The far seems near, and the near seems far." So basically, in this letter, in his correspondence to Ralph Waldo Emerson, he is actually describing all the different, I guess, natural parts of New York City, as contrasted with the hustle and bustle of Manhattan, of New York City at that point in time. So with that, let's actually go ahead and make our way down towards the Battery, and we'll be making our way right over here. We will walk north. Eventually we'll walk on down south to get into the Battery. To Ranger Anthony, everybody.
Hey, how's it going?
welcome to the beautiful, the glorious Battery Weed. This, of course, would be where the main guns of Fort Wadsworth would have been kept. As you guys see with these arched rooms right over here, all throughout the whole entire fortress, these rooms would have been utilized as spaces for where the big guns would have been kept. Now, if you guys take a look in either one of the two casemates, over on the left and over on the right, you'll see these big cannons. These cannons would have been used here at Wadsworth essentially as a way to, of course, help defend the fort and help defend Staten Island from anybody coming in through the Narrows. So let's actually go ahead and take a look at one of these guns right now.
So would one be in every one of these holes?
In the blueprint, yes.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that was not actually the case because of financial limitations. The Army really would have only had only a few dozen out of the 160 actually placed over here. So this is essentially what one of these cannons would have looked like if it was, of course, still over here. By the way, this is not a real gun. It's plastic. But we do kind of use this up just to kind of show you guys exactly what this would have looked like, at least when Battery Weed would have been first built, rebuilt in the 1860s and 1870s.
The Army wouldn't left it.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. As you guys can see, this was actually ingenious. They would actually use up these tracks right here. So the gun itself would actually swivel left or right. Now, generally, the gun itself would be pointed a little bit down towards where the water line would be. So that way, they could actually fire a shell or a shot or anything like that, a cannonball, and allow the cannonball or the shell to essentially skip right over the water. So it would be essentially kind of like taking a rock and letting the rock skip over the water. Now, why they did this is they would actually make the cannonball much more deadly, much more precise, and it could essentially kill anybody and anything along the way. Now, of course, this is not a real gun. We do have the real gun over along this side right here. So if you guys want, we can show you what these real cannons will look like. So this particular gun is going to be something called a Rodman gun. Rodman guns were very popular in the mid-century. Essentially, of course, just because they were very powerful, they were very, very, very heavy. Now these particular guns would have had a range of about 2.5 miles, 3 miles or so. And at some point in mid-century, they also would have outfitted at least some of these Rodman guns with rifling as well. I know some of you guys did actually take a look at the barrel deep inside over here, and you will notice, of course, that the gun does have these grooves along the inside of it. This is going to be called rifling. This is essentially what made the gun much more dangerous. You guys can imagine if you're throwing a football. If you're throwing a football, what do you need to do? You need to make the ball spin, right? Essentially, this is what the grooves would do. It would essentially make the cannonball spin while it is up in the air, which means that it's going to be much more dangerous and much more powerful, and definitely not something you want to be staring at.
And that's why a knuckleball does this.
Yes.
It has no spin at all.
Yes, absolutely. It really is all about the physics of these guns and the projectiles. This was something that was essentially came out with in the mid-century, and so by that point in time, because of the rifled guns and cannon, a lot of the old forts around New York Harbor, around the East Coast, were essentially deemed obsolete almost overnight, which is one reason why a lot of the forts around New York would have been rebuilt by the 1850s and 60s because of these very kinds of guns. Go ahead and make your way towards the parade ground. I want to show you guys something that is located right up on top of the battery. I want to show you guys the lighthouse. So, I'm going to bring you guys over here just so you guys can see the big, massive, rather not so massive, lighthouse that's just right above Fort Tompkins. If you guys walk a little further back, you can see what that lighthouse was going to look like. Now that lighthouse was installed here in 1903. It was actually first built has been in use from about 1980 until 1959. 1959, of course, was the year that they would have started work on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Obviously, this big, massive bridge has quite a lot of lights, which means that the little tiny sliver of lighting coming from Fort Tompkins Lighthouse or Fort Wadsworth Lighthouse is no longer going to be in use. It was deemed obsolete by 1959. However, if you guys were wondering, yes, the lighthouse still actually does work. We can turn it on if we wanted to. In fact, a few short years ago, in 2005, I believe, we did have a group of volunteers that came in here at Battery Weed, and essentially they would have outfitted the lighthouse with solar panels. So yes, we are bringing history into the 21st century, essentially. This is literally the only bridge connecting Staten Island with the rest of the city of New York. Now, there are 3 bridges going into New Jersey from Staten Island, but this, unfortunately, is the only one connecting it with the rest of the city. When it was first built up by 1965, this would have changed the entire character of the island itself. I do get folks on my tour that have actually lived in Staten Island, born and raised, and have been here before the bridge. They actually mentioned that before the bridge was built, they could actually find wild pigs, wild other animals roaming the streets of Highland Boulevard and the streets of Staten Island. So before the bridge, Staten Island was primarily hills, farms, woods, and quite a bit of countryside houses. After the bridge, this whole area essentially became suburbanized. So now, of course, we have all of New York City, most of New York City, almost all built up. However, that doesn't mean that Staten Island is still not built up. That's because this is the borough of Parks, and something like almost a quarter of the entire island is going to be park land. Compare that with the rest of New York City, with Brooklyn, with Manhattan, and you realize that Staten Island, despite being the forgotten island, is still a very, very special place. So the bridge itself would have been completed by 1965. This is actually a pet project of a gentleman named Robert Moses. If you guys are from New York City, you will definitely know who that guy is going to be. But basically, Robert Moses would have had quite a bit of power and influence for a period of almost 50, 60 years. By the way, Robert Moses in the early 20th century was essentially the most powerful non-elected official anywhere in the state of New York, which means that he was actually able to build up all these different pet projects of his. Most of his pet projects primarily would have been roadways. So he would have actually built up the Verrazano Bridge. He also would have built up the Staten Island Expressway, the Belton Parkway, which is that big highway running along the shoreline of Brooklyn. That was also his pet project as well. Now, the other big name associated with this bridge is somebody by the name of Othmar Ammann. He was an Austrian bridge builder. Now, Mr. Ammann actually helped build not just the Verrazano, but essentially built up the Bayonne Bridge, the Goethals Bridge, and the Outer Bridge Crossing. So all 4 bridges connecting Staten Island with the rest of the world was essentially built up by this gentleman, Othmar Ammann. In fact, it was also going to be his last pet project. Unfortunately, the construction of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge would have done a number of damage to not just Staten Island, the historic Fort Wadsworth, but it did also essentially displace hundreds, if not thousands, of the local population over in Bay Ridge. In fact, a lot of folks in New York City who did live through that whole entire ordeal are still very much angry at Mr. Moses 50 years on. So, let's go ahead.
All right, we have concluded the tour. I know it's been quite lengthy if you made it this far, but I want to thank you for coming along. It was to me, highly informative of a place I would never have thought of the history here. Thank you so much for coming along. Behind me you will see New York City, Lower Manhattan, and down over the hill you will see Battery Weed, where we just came from. And also you will notice where we started, right over there was Fort Tompkins. Thank you for coming along today, and see you the next adventure. Bye-bye.